let's just focus on the dollar first. Where do you see the dollar heading, given that finance ministers in Europe are meeting to discuss ways to rebalance currencies today? And also, I believe we had comments from Stiglitz saying that the dominance of the dollar may be fading.
Yes, overall we're still very positive on the dollar, pretty much across the board. But at the moment we would be focusing on the dollar's performance against the low yielders, or against currencies where the central banks are still very much in a dovish mode. We think that's where the dollar strength is going to show itself initially, but later on I'd expect to be a far broader based recovery in the dollar which starts to take hold. So for the time being I'll be looking very much at the dollar's performance against the Scandinavian currencies, for instance, against Sweden and Norway, where we've seen the central banks there take on a very dovish tone recently, and obviously that was highlighted by last week's move by the Riksbank with that very aggressive rate cut. So that I think is going to lead to further dollar strength against the low yielders initially, but then start to broaden out against the rest of the G10, I think, as we head in towards the end of the year.
Right, and how about the comments from Lagarde? Does it just symbolize a divergence in central bank policies?
I think it's quite interesting when we look at the comments coming from the IMF regarding the growth picture, and then we balance that with some of the comments which have come from the BIS recently, where they've warned about monetary policy remaining too loose for too long. So balancing these two things together, it does actually keep the focus, I think, very much on central bank policy, and we are seeing this divergence within the G10 where we have a couple of the central banks, namely the Bank of England and later on probably the Fed as well, starting to become more hawkish. But then we have the other central banks who are trying to maintain a very loose policy against those signs of hawkishness developing elsewhere. So Scandinavia is one place where we've seen that very, very clearly, but also the ECB still very much has a very dovish policy in place, and that was highlighted again by the most recent comments over the weekend from ECB officials. So again, the euro, we're expecting that to remain under a lot of pressure as well. And against the dollar, we'll be looking for that to head down towards the 135 area initially. But I think once we start to break through that level, which was, as you remember, the low back in June, that will then start to open up, I think, a lot more downside potential. And for going into the end of the year, we'll be looking for a move down into the 131 area for euro dollar.